My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 62 years old, and the day I remarried was the day my own son decided to laugh at me in public. I was standing under soft yellow lights in a modest community hall in suburban Connecticut, holding a bouquet that smelled faintly of eucalyptus. I'd chosen it myself because it felt calm, not dramatic. The kind of flowers a woman chooses when she's not trying to prove anything anymore. The ceremony had just ended. The music was still settling in the air when I heard it. A laugh. It wasn't polite. It wasn't restrained. It cut through the room in a way that made my shoulders tighten before my mind even caught up. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. My son, Evan, when I did turn my head, I saw him leaning toward his wife, Lauren. Her phone tilted just enough that the screen reflected the lights. She wasn't texting. She was recording. Evan whispered something, and Lauren pressed her lips together, failing to hide the smirk that followed. They weren't laughing at the ceremony. They were laughing at the man standing beside me. Thomas stood calmly, his hands folded, his posture steady. His suit wasn't new. His shoes were worn at the edges. He looked exactly like what he was, a quiet older man who didn't feel the need to announce himself to the world. I heard Lauren murmur, "Is that really what she married?" Evan replied, louder than he meant to. Guess Mom's standards dropped. A few people nearby shifted in their chairs. One of the servers stopped walking, frozen with a tray of salmon salad balanced in her hands, unsure whether to keep moving. In that moment, something settled heavily in my chest. My son was embarrassed by me, by my happiness, by the man I loved. What Evan didn't know, what no one at that table understood, was that the man they were mocking had spent his life quietly shaping the skyline they drove past every day. And as I stood there, listening to my own child laugh, I realized this wedding was about to become something very different from what I had imagined. I hadn't planned a big wedding. At 62, I no longer believed happiness needed an audience. What I wanted was something quieter, something steady. I wanted to stand beside someone without feeling the need to defend my choices or explain why I deserved them. After my first husband died, 14 years passed in a way that surprised me. Not loudly, not dramatically. Life simply narrowed. I went to work at the hospital, came home, cooked for one, and slept on my side of the bed. I wasn't miserable, but I wasn't truly seen either. I told myself that was adulthood, that this was what independence looked like. I raised my son the best way I knew how. I showed up. I paid what I could. I listened when he needed me. When Evan left home, I adjusted. When he married Lauren, I adjusted again. My place in his life became smaller, quieter, more conditional. I learned not to ask too many questions. I learned to wait for calls that sometimes never came. When Thomas entered my life, there was no announcement, no moment where everything suddenly changed. We met while volunteering at the local library, shelving books on Tuesday mornings. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if words mattered. He asked about my work, my son, my life, and he listened without interrupting. That alone felt unusual. I didn't rush to tell Evan, not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted to be sure this wasn't loneliness disguising itself as hope. When I did tell him, his reaction was polite but distant. He asked practical questions. How old was Thomas? Where did he live? What did he do? He didn't ask how I felt being with him. The first time Evan met Thomas, I watched closely. Evan smiled, but his eyes moved quickly, cataloging details: the age of Thomas's jacket, the absence of jewelry, the kind of car he drove. Lauren asked questions that sounded friendly but landed sharp, circling around finances and plans. Thomas answered calmly, never offering more than was asked. When Thomas proposed, I said yes without hesitation, not because I needed security, but because I felt respected. We agreed on a small wedding. I insisted on paying for it myself. I wanted no misunderstandings, no debts disguised as gifts. This was my decision, and I wanted it to remain that way. The venue was a modest community hall, nothing extravagant, just clean lines, soft lighting, and enough space for people who mattered, old co-workers from the hospital, neighbors who had checked on me after my husband passed, people who knew my history and still showed up. On the afternoon of the wedding, I arrived early. I watched staff set tables and straighten chairs. I noticed how carefully the servers handled the glassware, how the caterer checked the trays twice before sending them out. These details steadied me. They reminded me that this was real, tangible, happening. Thomas arrived shortly after. He wore the same suit he always did, neatly pressed, familiar. He smiled when he saw me, not nervously, not proudly, but with quiet warmth. When he took my hand, my breathing slowed without effort. Evan and Lauren arrived late. Evan hugged me quickly, distracted. Lauren scanned the room, adjusting her dress, checking her phone. Their attention drifted past us, not toward us. I noticed it, but chose not to comment. I told myself the day was about joy, not observation. The ceremony itself was simple. Vows spoken without embellishment, music soft enough not to overpower the words. When Thomas looked at me, I felt anchored in a way I hadn't expected. For a brief moment, everything felt aligned. It was during the reception that the air changed. As servers began bringing out the first plates, I noticed Evan leaning toward Lauren. Their heads were close together, their expressions tight. They weren't listening to the speeches. They weren't watching us. They were watching Thomas, whispering, smiling in a way that felt closed, private, excluding. I told myself not to overthink it. I told myself I was being sensitive. But mothers recognize shifts before they become movements. Standing there with my glass raised, smiling for photographs, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the kind that comes when something important is about to be tested. I didn't yet know what Evan would say. I only knew this moment wasn't as safe as I had believed. The first laugh reached me before I was ready to admit what it meant. It didn't stop the music, but it carried, sharp, careless, unmistakably amused. I turned just enough to see my son, Evan, leaning back in his chair as if he were watching a show he didn't respect. Lauren sat beside him with her phone tilted at that familiar angle people use when they want evidence later. The screen caught the overhead lights. She wasn't texting. She was filming. Thomas stood a few feet away, talking with a woman I'd worked with for years. His suit was clean and neatly pressed, but it wasn't new. His shoes were polished, though the toes showed honest wear. He looked like what he was, a quiet older man who didn't care about impressing anyone. And that, apparently, was the joke. Evan leaned toward Lauren and murmured something I couldn't hear. Lauren pressed her lips together, then let out a short laugh that wasn't warm. Evan flicked his fingers toward Thomas's shoes, like he was pointing out a stain. Two guests nearby exchanged a look and then looked away, the polite discomfort people wear at weddings when they don't want to take sides. A server slowed as she passed with salmon salad and rolls, her eyes darting from Evan to me and then down to the floor. The room didn't get louder, but it felt tighter. The air grew heavy with the awareness that something ugly was happening in a place meant for celebration. Heat climbed up my neck. Not anger yet. Embarrassment. I had told myself for years that I didn't need my son's approval. But standing there in my wedding dress, I felt exposed. Thomas glanced at me once, concern in his eyes. I gave a small shake of my head. Don't step in. Let me handle it. The speeches continued, cheerful and harmless, but I barely heard a word. My attention kept sliding back to Evan's table. He wasn't watching me. He was watching Thomas, like he was trying to measure him and come up with a number. When the laughter came again, louder this time, something inside me shifted. Not a dramatic snap, more like a door closing gently but finally. I set my glass down and walked toward them. Conversations nearest to me faded. Evan looked up, surprise flashing across his face, then amusement settling in. "Mom," he said, smiling thinly. "What's going on?" "Come outside with me," I said. He didn't move. He leaned back even farther. "Relax," he said. "We're just joking. You're being sensitive." Sensitive. As if the problem was my hearing, my pride, my imagination. I looked at Lauren. Her phone was still in her hand. She watched me like she was waiting to see whether I'd cry. I spoke clearly, without raising my voice. I reminded Evan of the years I worked double shifts to keep the lights on and his tuition paid. I reminded him of the way I showed up, rides, signatures, second chances. Then I reminded him of the first time I asked him for help when I was sick, and he answered me with conditions instead of concern. I didn't embellish. I simply described what had happened, and I watched his face change from amusement to irritation, then to a flushed, defensive anger. Lauren's smile faded. Her phone lowered into her lap like it had suddenly become too heavy. Evan stood up fast, his chair scraping loudly. "You're doing this here?" he hissed. "You're embarrassing me." "I'm not embarrassing you," I said. "You're embarrassing yourself." "This is my wedding," I told him. "Steady now. You don't get to mock the person I love and call it a joke." Evan opened his mouth again, but I held up my hand, firm. "I want you and Lauren to leave." For a moment, he stared at me like he didn't recognize who I was, like mothers weren't allowed to set boundaries. Around us, forks hovered above plates. Someone's laugh died mid-breath. I heard the soft clink of glass against glass as a guest set their drink down too hard. A woman I'd known for decades gave me a small, encouraging nod, the kind that says, "You're not wrong, even if it hurts." That nod kept my voice from shaking right now. A security staff member approached, calm and professional. I nodded once and repeated quietly that my son and his wife needed to go. Evan protested, voice rising, but the room had already decided what was happening. No one laughed with him. Lauren finally stood, avoiding my gaze, her face blank. They walked out together. The doors closed behind them with a soft, final sound. The music stumbled for a beat, then resumed. I stood there, feeling the strength drain from my legs, and for a terrifying second, I thought I might fall. Thomas reached for my hand. His grip was warm, steady, real. And in that quiet aftershock, I let myself feel what I had been refusing to name, the pain of realizing my own child could look at my happiness and choose cruelty. After Evan and Lauren left, the room never returned to what it had been. The music kept playing, but it sounded distant, as if it were coming from somewhere far outside the building. Conversations restarted in careful fragments. People spoke more quietly, choosing their words with restraint, as though volume itself might make things worse. I stayed where I was, standing beside Thomas, focusing on the warmth of his hand around mine to keep myself steady. My legs felt weak, not in a dramatic way, but in the slow, draining way that comes after holding yourself upright for too long. Thomas didn't ask if I was all right. He didn't fill the silence with reassurances. He stayed close, letting me decide when to move, when to breathe, when to speak. After a few minutes, I excused myself and walked toward the small room behind the hall where I had changed earlier. The door closed softly behind me, muting the noise of the reception. I sat down on the folding chair and looked at my hands. They were trembling, even though my breathing had slowed. I had asked my own son to leave my wedding. The reality of it settled fully then, heavy and unavoidable. I waited for panic to follow, for regret, for the instinct to stand up, walk back out, and undo everything I had just done. Instead, what came was grief, not sharp or explosive, but deep and aching. The kind that doesn't ask permission before it takes up space. I realized, sitting there alone, that this moment had not begun that evening. It had been forming quietly over years. In the phone calls, Evan didn't return. In the visits, he postponed. In the way he spoke to me carefully, as if managing a responsibility rather than talking to his mother. I had allowed it because I told myself that peace mattered more than honesty. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Thomas stepped inside when I answered. He didn't crowd the room or rush toward me. He sat beside me, leaving enough space that I didn't feel cornered. "I didn't want to say anything earlier," he said gently. "This was your moment." I nodded. My throat tightened, but I kept my voice steady. "Thank you for letting me handle it." We returned to the reception together. Plates had been cleared. Fresh drinks had been poured. Someone asked if we wanted to continue with the planned dances. I hesitated only briefly before agreeing. Ending the night early would have meant letting Evan's behavior define everything that followed, and I wasn't willing to give him that power. As Thomas and I moved slowly across the floor, I felt the attention of the room shift. People watched us carefully, not with curiosity but concern. I realized then that while my son had chosen to leave, others had chosen to stay. That understanding steadied me more than I expected. Later, when most of the guests had gone and the hall was nearly empty, Thomas and I sat together at a quiet table. Chairs were stacked along the walls. Staff moved efficiently around us, clearing the last traces of the evening without drawing attention to themselves. "There's something I should explain," Thomas said. I turned toward him, tired but listening. He spoke calmly, without drama, about his family, about the business he had stepped away from years ago, about why he chose a quieter life now. He explained it not as a revelation meant to impress, but as context, filling in parts of his life he had never felt the need to emphasize. I listened, surprised but not overwhelmed. What stayed with me wasn't the scale of what he described, but the intention behind it, the choice to value presence over image, to live simply because complexity no longer served him. "I wanted you to choose me without any of that," he said. "I did," I replied, without hesitation. That certainty didn't erase the pain of the evening, but it gave it shape. I thought about how often I had mistaken endurance for love, how often I had swallowed disappointment to avoid conflict. Sitting there, I understood that boundaries weren't punishments. They were definitions of what I was willing to accept. When we finally left the hall, the night air felt cool and grounding. The drive home was quiet, marked by the steady rhythm of passing streetlights. I wondered if Evan would call, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to anticipate his reaction. At the house, Thomas turned off the engine and waited. "Whatever comes next," he said softly, "we'll face it together." I nodded. Later, lying awake in bed, I listened to the house settle around us. The silence felt unfamiliar, but not empty. It held the weight of what I had lost and what I had chosen to keep. For the first time in years, I didn't measure my worth by my son's approval. I measured it by the quiet strength it had taken to remain standing when sitting down would have been easier. The morning after the wedding arrived quietly, without the emotional crash I had braced myself for. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen window and settled across the table where unopened cards lay stacked neatly, each one signed with familiar handwriting. The flowers from the night before still filled the room with a soft, fading scent. Thomas moved gently through the space, pouring coffee, setting a mug in front of me without a word. I appreciated the silence more than comfort. I kept expecting my phone to ring. It didn't. By the afternoon, a message finally appeared on my screen. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a question about how I was feeling. Evan asked if I had talked Thomas into helping with a situation he was dealing with. The words were clipped, practical, empty of reflection. I stared at the message longer than I needed to. In the past, I would have answered immediately. I would have asked what he needed, how serious it was, how much money might solve it. I would have convinced myself that helping him meant I was still important, that my role as his mother required sacrifice without limits. This time, I set the phone face down and walked away. Thomas didn't comment. He didn't ask what the message said. He trusted me to decide what came next, and that trust felt heavier than advice. Over the following days, more messages arrived. Evan's tone shifted gradually, from casual to strained, then edged with frustration. He hinted at financial pressure, at obligations that were closing in on him. He never mentioned the wedding, never mentioned the laughter, never acknowledged how we had parted. That absence spoke louder than anger ever could. I realized then that what hurt most wasn't his request for help. It was his certainty that help was still owed, that access to me was automatic, regardless of how he behaved. For years, I had allowed that belief to settle quietly between us. When I finally responded, I chose my words carefully. I told him I cared about his well-being. I told him I was willing to talk, to help him think through options, to support him in ways that didn't involve money. I told him clearly that financial help was no longer something I could offer. The silence that followed lasted longer than any argument we had ever had. Life moved forward in small, ordinary ways. Thomas and I developed routines without discussion. Evening walks, shared meals, conversations about books, weather, nothing urgent. He never pressured me to reconcile, never offered opinions about my son. That restraint allowed space for healing I hadn't known I needed. Weeks later, Evan asked if we could meet. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe with mismatched chairs and chipped mugs. He looked tired, older than I remembered. He stirred his drink long after the spoon should have stopped moving, avoiding my eyes. He didn't apologize right away. He spoke about stress, about feeling trapped, about mistakes he didn't know how to undo. I listened without interrupting, without rescuing the conversation. When he finally looked up, his voice softened. "I didn't think you'd actually make me leave," he said. That was when I understood something important. His shock wasn't rooted in guilt. It was rooted in surprise that I had drawn a boundary at all. I told him calmly that love didn't mean tolerance, that being his mother didn't require me to accept disrespect. I told him I wasn't asking him to approve of my choices, only to treat them with dignity. He nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. There was no dramatic resolution that day, no sweeping apology, no promise that everything would change overnight. What we had was smaller and more honest, recognition. He saw me differently, and I allowed myself to be seen. In the months that followed, Evan's behavior shifted in subtle ways, not consistently, not perfectly, but there were pauses where there hadn't been before. He spoke less about money and more about responsibility. I didn't rush to reward that change. I let it develop at its own pace. Thomas never inserted himself into that process. He didn't offer solutions or demand gratitude. He remained who he had always been, steady, present, respectful. One evening, as we sat together on the porch watching the light fade from the sky, I thought about how close I had come to shrinking myself to preserve peace, how easy it would have been to apologize for something I hadn't done wrong. I realized then that the wedding hadn't been the turning point. The turning point had been my decision to stop chasing approval. Family, I learned, is not built on endurance. It's built on honesty, on knowing where you end and someone else begins. Love without boundaries isn't love, it's surrender. I don't know what the future holds for my son. I don't know how much we will repair or how long it will take. But I know this. Standing up for myself did not make me a bad mother. It made me a whole person. And that, finally, was enough.